Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back again. A few days ago, I recorded this discussion that you'll have just listened to with Professor David Benatar on antinatalism. And afterwards, Professor Benatar listened back to the conversation and thought that there were some clarifications that needed to be made. We were kind of speaking in the time constraints of having about an hour, so we left a few topics in the air and some things weren't fully explicated. So we wanted to take an opportunity to just sit and discuss some of the points of contention and some of the bits that Professor Benatar wanted to clarify as a little addendum to the conversation we had. Does that sound about right, Professor?
That sounds great. Thank you very much. Yes.
Sure thing. Okay, so I suppose the best way to do this, let's just jump in, and if you just want to let me know some of the points that you heard upon listening back to the conversation that you thought wanted some clarification, and we'll see where it goes.
Good. I think there are quite a few, but let me rather concentrate on what I take to be the more important ones.
Sure thing.
It seemed on a number of occasions we were speaking past one another about the question of the value of pain and pleasure, both in their presence and in their absence. And you were insisting that the absence of pain and the absence of pleasure in the non-existing person is neutral. And I was actually agreeing with you about that. But where I think we were speaking at cross purposes was that when I say that the absence of pain is good and the absence of pleasure is not bad, I'm not referring to the intrinsic value of the obviously neutral states in the non-existing person. What I'm speaking about is a comparative judgment. So when I compare the absence of the pain in the non-existing person with the presence of the pain in the person who would exist in the alternative scenario, I take the absence to be better than the presence. And so when I say it is good, I mean it is good in a comparative sense, not in an intrinsic sense. And so I can fully accept your point about the intrinsic neutrality of the state. I agree about that. I'm simply making a comparative claim. When I make that comparative claim, I don't know whether you agree or disagree, but I just need to clarify that that's what I meant.
But that's what you meant. I suppose the confusion for me there would have been that when you use terminology like good, for instance, if I were comparing two negative states, if there were two instances of horrific suffering or something, but one was slightly less worse, I would hesitate to call it good, even comparatively speaking, to make an argument that kind of said that if forced to choose between two really bad options, that one is good. If there are two candidates in an election, both of whom you think are terrible, it would seem like a strange thing for me to say that it would be good to vote for one of them or something like that, rather than kind of framing it as being less bad or something like that, if that makes sense.
Well, I don't want to get bogged down in the particulars of the example because
Mm-hmm.
it may in fact be good to vote for the less bad of the candidates.
Sure, actually, that makes sense.
But
Yes.
but that's not an analogous case to the one I'm referring to. So I certainly can grant your point that there are bads of varying degrees and goods of varying degrees. But the point I'm making is that the absence of all the pain that there would be in the life of the existing person, that is good in the sense that it is better than that alternative.
Sure. Now, this may be due to a lack of full understanding still of exactly what you're saying, but what's the problem with saying, for purposes of clarification, what's the problem of saying that if a life, when it did come into existence, had a majority of pleasure, that compared to the state of neutrality, because that would be better, there would be, let's say, more of a good thing, something like this. Why can we not say that existing in that instance is good compared to the neutrality of existence if there is a majority of pleasure?
Well, this is where I think you're getting ahead of yourself because you're reaching an overall judgment about the net value of existence before you've compared the components, namely the presence or absence of the pains and the pleasures. So before I reach a judgment about whether coming into existence is a net harm, a net benefit, or neutral, I want to compare the presence and the absence of pain and the presence and absence of pleasure in the two options. And so I think the absence of the pain is good, and by that I mean it is comparatively good with the alternative. But the absence of pleasure, I think, is not bad. And what I mean by that is when you compare it with the alternative, it's not bad that it's absent, and it's not bad because there's nobody who is deprived of it.
Right. So it's not bad even in a comparative sense. It's not worse, that is to say.
Exactly. It's not
I
worse. It's
see.
not. That's exactly the point. Now, once you've got those two comparisons in place, now you're in a fit state to make the evaluation about the overall value of the life.
Okay,
But
that
this,
that makes sense.
sorry, yeah, this does lead us to the second concern. So you argued that one doesn't need the axiological asymmetry in order to generate the antinatalist conclusion, because if you think, and you didn't actually commit to this yourself, that you believe this, but you said if one thought that the the bad in the life outweighs the good, or let's say the bad in all lives outweighs the good in all lives, then you could reach the antinatalist conclusion even without the axiological asymmetry. And I agree that you can reach the antinatalist conclusion without the axiological asymmetry. But what I wanted to resist, and I did resist this in multiple points in our discussion, was the inference that therefore the axiological asymmetry is false. What I didn't do, I think, was to clarify why, in some detail, why I would want to adhere to the axiological asymmetry. I gestured at there being a whole range of considerations, but I didn't sort of specify what some of those are. So let me just cite a one for you. Uh, Almost everybody's going to deny that most lives contain more bad than good. Yet most people accept that, for example, there is no duty to bring a happy person into existence, but there is a duty to avoid an unhappy person. So if there's an axiological asymmetry that explains the judgments that most people make about these things, then it's got an explanatory value which your hypothesis doesn't have. So it's not that anybody who advances the view that you held is incoherent in some way. They have reached antinatalism without the axiological asymmetry, but there's nonetheless a great explanatory value in that axiological asymmetry.
Sure. To clarify on my part, I wouldn't say. Let me see how this was worded. I wouldn't, and I hope people don't interpret me as saying that because antinatalism can be reached as a conclusion without the axiological asymmetry, that therefore there's a problem with the axiological asymmetry. That would be a totally invalid syllogism, of course. I suppose I was making two separate points. One is that in isolation, I felt like the asymmetry could be challenged. But that wasn't because you could reach the antinatalist conclusion without it. It was just a side note for clarification that said that just so that people know you can reach it without the axiological asymmetry. So if there is a criticism that you have that you think holds, you can still be an antinatalist. But it's worthwhile making the clarification you made there, I think.
Thanks. Yes, I'm pleased you accept that, because I had the sense in the conversation that you were vacillating between those two positions, and that sometimes you were moving from the claim that the axiological asymmetry wasn't necessary to the point that this was actually a challenge against the axiological asymmetry. So if that's cleared up, then that's great. This is an important feature of our subsequent conversation here.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't think that it's because it works without the asymmetry that the asymmetry would fail. I don't think that's the reason that it fails, if that makes sense. Now, I hope people didn't interpret me that way. Maybe some of them did. Maybe I actually did say things that suggested that. Part of the reason for that might be, and it's worth listeners kind of reflecting on this, is that because this is quite a unique area of philosophy that isn't addressed very much, sometimes I suppose the terminology can get mixed up if you haven't been spending a long time making sure that you're using everything correctly and specifically. So it may well be that at a number of points I accidentally equivocated, or I kind of misunderstood an argument quite badly or something like that. So it is really worth paying attention when listening to a conversation of a topic that's brand new, and I hope listeners can do that. Are there any other areas that you feel are of pressing need to make sure that we're on the same page about?
Thanks. Yeah, first let me say that I think you're quite right. These are very difficult matters. It's hard to get one's head around them. They're very challenging. I think is one of the reasons that makes them so interesting. So I think there are two other points that I wanted to raise. The one was about the Epicurean arguments. And there were places where I think I was insufficiently precise in what I said about the Epicurean argument. I did correct it later on. I made it clear what I meant by that. The odd thing for the Epicurean is that just as they can't say that death is bad for the person who dies, they also can't say that it is good for the person who dies. And both you and I acknowledged that in the course of the discussion. One of the counterintuitive implications of that is that if you have somebody who is suffering, they're in extremis, they got a terminal condition, you can't say that it's better for them to die. I can say that. I can say it's better because I don't believe that you have to exist in both of the scenarios in order to make the comparative judgment. But if you're somebody like the Epicurean who insists on what's sometimes called the existence requirement, that is to say, you have to exist in both of the scenarios in order for the comparison to be made, they do run into that difficulty. But I can explain why death would be better for somebody who's suffering greatly. Now, of course, you don't have to accept the antinatalist argument in order to reach that conclusion, but you do have to be able to compare existence and non-existence.
Yes.
And I do that with the coming into existence case, and I also do it with the going out of existence case.
Right. I understand your point about consistency, and I would tend to agree, but I would question whether the Epicurean is committed to saying, especially if we consider the term good being used in a comparative sense. I wonder if an Epicurean could still say, although famously, death is nothing to us. When death comes, we're not there, and when we're here, it's not there. That still, if somebody is suffering, the Epicurean could say that it's good to die in the sense that it's better to be dead, because that it's better to have nothing than to have something if that something is a net negative. I wonder if they'd be committed to it in that respect.
I don't think you can say that.
But again,
I think.
I don't want to kind of get caught up in our disagreements here, rather than the points of clarification, if you see what I mean.
Sure. Look, I think they can say that continued life would be bad, but what they can't say is that it would be either good or better.
So continued life being bad, kind of relative to, because the way I understand that is if the Epicurean says that continued life is bad, then they're kind of saying as compared to not continued life. That's what makes it bad. We're kind of comparing continuing life and not continuing life, and they say that continuing life is bad, which would imply that not continuing life is not bad, which if not bad is better than bad, then by the way that you're using the term good, I suppose I could say that that's better and therefore good.
Be careful, because I can say it, but they can't say it, because the whole point is that they can't compare existence with non-existence and reach a conclusion about what's better for the person. Because you aren't there when you're dead, death can't be worse for you, on their view, not on my view, on their view. And just as it can't be worse, it also can't be better.
Is this like the non-identity problem that you think that they're committed to, the idea that they can't say anything about a person who's dead because they believe that that the person who's dead, there's nothing of them?
They're just not there.
Yeah.
Non-identity problem is normally with advanced, or that term is used with regard to coming into existence. Yeah. But they think you can only make these comparisons if somebody exists. If somebody ceases to exist, you can't say it's better or worse for them, which is just another of the odd implications of Epicureanism. There are a whole array of them. And so when I did say in our earlier discussion that when I'm trying to reflect on whether I should accept the Epicurean view, I need to examine all of its implications and see whether on balance this is a wise view to accept. And when I do that, I don't reach that conclusion that it's a wise view to accept. Obviously, I've not done it full justice here. This is, as I said earlier, an old and a resilient argument. There's much more to be said that could be said in a podcast. But I do think what we've discussed now is clarificatory and advances our earlier discussion.
Yes. So I want to press to the listener that the purpose of this addendum here is to clarify points. So I would stress that I still disagree with a lot of what you're saying here. I'd even potentially disagree still with the idea that Epicureanism is committed to what you're saying it is. I'm not sure on that. Maybe it's something that I'll revisit and write about in the future, but our purposes here are just to make sure that we at least understand the points that are kind of being made as they're being made, right? So I think when I'm saying kind of sure that makes sense throughout this little conversation that we're having now, I don't mean in terms of I'm bowled over and agree with you. I just mean to say that that's a useful clarification, but it doesn't mean that I agree with the argument. Having said that, we can kind of keep going for as many as you think are worth clarifying, unless that was the last major one that you had.
just one more, if you don't mind.
Of course.
So at the end of our discussion, you were presenting me with the benevolent world exploder. You didn't use exactly that terminology, but you asked if I was presented with the option of destroying all sentient life, then would I press the button or not? And the challenge was obviously, because of all the suffering of generations in the future that I could prevent, there's presumably some very strong reason for me to press that button. And I stepped through the different theoretical positions, and I suggested that a utilitarian might be willing to press the button, but might also not want to let on that they would press the button because there might be negative consequences to letting on. And then I raised the case of the deontologist and said, well, they may well not press the button because although there'd be a vast amount of suffering that they'd be preventing, they might plausibly say it's not within their rights to press that button. And I gave the example of somebody who is suffering from a terminal disease. It's very likely, let's say, in my view, that the bad far outweighs the good and that it would be in their interest to die. And I asked myself, should I kill this person? And my view is, no, I shouldn't, because if this person is competent, then they get to decide for themselves. They may well be mistaken, but I don't get to override a competent person and decide to take them out of existence if they want to continue. And my point, and I didn't make this, I suppose I said it to some extent, my point about the benevolent world exploder is that you just multiply that case by, let's say, 7 or 8 billion cases in the case of human beings, and even still more in the case of all the other sentient beings. So just as I don't have a right to kill the one person, I wouldn't have the right to kill all of the others. Yeah. What I worried about in the discussion was that we got a little bogged down about the case you raised of the time traveler. And I noted that that was a sort of hypothetical case, but it's not the hypotheticality of it that counts per se. I think that it's just not relevant to the example I was giving.
Yes, and as I said to you privately not long ago, reflecting on it, I do think that the time traveler case is disanalogous in the crucial aspect that the person is therefore making the decision for themselves. And the point that you were making was that you don't have the right to make the decision on behalf of somebody else who's competent. The point that I would probably make if I were to kind of rehash it under that light would be to say that presumably you as much as you don't think I have a right to override that person's autonomy, you also think that that person doesn't have a right to bring people into existence. So the way that I see it on the anti-natalist view is that we have here a conflict of rights. We have a situation where, yes, if I killed people, it would violate their rights. But if I don't kill these people, I know that they're going to violate other people's rights, that is, the people who haven't been born yet, by causing them to suffer. And so you've kind of got a situation whereby if you don't, you know somebody is going to violate someone else's rights, do you have the right to violate the first person's right, knowing that that's the only way to stop them from violating another person's right, especially if that violation that they're going to commit is of generational proportions? But then the question becomes about the nature of when and if we can override rights, which isn't necessarily kind of a question that's specific to antinatalism, but would be a question that would need to inform your answer as to whether you personally would press the button. I hope that makes sense.
In a way, yes. So you have to distinguish here, I think, between a utilitarianism of rights and a strictly deontological view. So a utilitarian of rights would seek the minimization of rights violations, but then you are dealing with a version or a species of utilitarianism. And so it's just a question of minimizing rights violations.
Sure.
Deontologists, I think, there'd be a much higher bar there. So I'm not saying that deontologists are always committed to respecting rights irrespective of the outcome and irrespective of what other rights violations might follow. There's going to be an extremely strong presumption, and in some versions of deontology, an absolute prohibition on killing innocents in order to prevent them from violating rights down the line. I mean, think about this, for example. Among the people that you would kill in the benevolent world exploder are sentient animals who are not moral agents and so not violating anybody's rights. Yes. You'd also have human babies who would potentially become procreators down the line, and you've got no idea whether they would or wouldn't procreate, but you'd certainly be violating their right to life in the process. So there'd be lots of rights violation there that couldn't be justified in the way that you were suggesting.
Yeah, I could see ways around it, but again, that would be a point of disagreement rather than one of clarification. I suppose just to close out, because thinking about it now, we never kind of landed on a question, and perhaps it's one that you wouldn't want to personally answer, but I wonder what the answer, in your view, would be to the question of whether it is good to press the button. I don't mean from each perspective. I mean from your perspective. If the button is in front of you, am I to take from what you've just said that you would not press the button?
I think let's leave my view on this particular one out of. I've spelled out the different options and I've shown you
Sure.
that there's no implication. I may answer that at some point, but I think I'd just rather not answer it
That's
now.
fine. Leave it to the consideration of the audience at least. I know that certainly when I've been asked it in the past, I've not wanted to answer it because it can. It's one of those really controversial questions, so I totally understand that. Well, unless there's anything that you wanted to clarify on top of that, I think you said that was the last point, the last major point at least.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Well, then I just wanted to thank you again and do so publicly to say that it's the fact that you wanted to have this conversation shows that you do really care about making sure that our listeners are understanding you properly and really getting the best chance at engaging properly with the antinatalist argument. So it's refreshing to see. This hasn't happened with a guest before. It's nice that you've kind of listened back and been willing to do this follow-up. I hope people listening will take this seriously and take these clarifications on board and go and revisit the arguments that Professor Benatar makes and read the book with these things in mind, and see what they think about it. And if they do have any points or questions about it, leave a comment in the original video, because I know that there's a very strong, active anti-natalist community online who are always willing to talk about these things and respond to comments like that. So do be willing to do so. But really, yes, I have to thank you again, Professor Benatar, for joining me and for doing this follow-up discussion.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your being willing to do the follow up.